We're going to try and get started. So let's talk about our topic for the day. Our topic for the day, you will find in this textbook. We are in the classroom, right? Yeah. And go to page 64, and it's on the subject of chapter 3 on ecosystem dynamics. But I'd rather talk about fuel.
Yeah.
That was Tim's idea. So, I've got a pointer that actually sort of works. It's a little bitty thing. These things keep getting smaller. So, believe it or not, we started this project in December of 2009. This was right after the Obama administration came in and the EPA was making all kinds of noises about lead, and it had everybody panicked and scared to death. And that following summer, they had a big tent forum at Oshkosh, and they were whining, moaning, groaning, complaining about what are we going to do, what are we going to do, the sky is falling. And at the end of that, Michael Kraft, President of Lycoming, went over and took the microphone, and that's the quote. We've been studying this problem for 20-something years. We've got to quit loving this problem and just fix it. Oshkosh, July 26, 13 years ago. That Cirrus is our turbo-normalized Cirrus with a high compression IL 550, and it's been flying on G100UL Avgas off and on for the last 13 years. And that's what it looks like. Yeah, it's the right color, especially for California. That was pulled out of a tank, or out of a barrel that we're getting ready to ship to Robinson Helicopter, because they're going to do some of their own validation testing here in the very near future. So September 1st of last year, finally, after almost 13 years, the FAA sent me an email, and in that email, which is right here, they said, here's your STCs again, reissued from the year before with a limited AML, and this time the engine AML included every single spark ignition piston engine in the FAA's type certificate database, without exception. And all of the aircraft that use any one of those engines. I got to tell you, we had to get a young whiz kid who was a summer intern for us to go through and write software to mine the FAA's database in order to pull all that out and get it properly organized. So that's a red letter day. These engineers at Wichita that took over the project, you'll see in a minute, really did a spectacular job, and they're really good people, really superb engineers. We've had some really good ones as this project's gone along. Unfortunately, they've been compromised by some very difficult people inside the FAA that have tried to slow the project down. But you know, that's the way life is sometimes. So back to Michael Kraft's comment. I want to share this thought with you. On September 1st, as old George Jones might have said, that's the day we all quit loving this problem, hopefully. So a little bit of talk about safely using high-octane unleaded avgas. Last July, unfortunately, at Reed Hillview, I'm not exactly sure what the backstory is on that. I've had a couple of versions, but I've verified one of them. Apparently this guy's plane was on the ground at Reed Hillview for maintenance when they banned 100 low lead, and he had 100 low lead in there enough to fly away, but the maintenance shop kept having problems and kept doing ground runs and burned up a bunch of his fuel. And he got out there, he couldn't get any 100 low lead. He thought he had enough fuel to get over to San Jose, and he took off. And come on, folks, it's our safety talk. Don't do this stuff. Do you know there's only one rule in aviation? This may be the most important thing you hear today. One rule in aviation. One rule, one rule, one. Anybody know what it is?
Don't be stupid.
Real close. Don't look stupid in the NTSB accident report. It's okay to crash, things break. Okay? Just don't look stupid in the NTSB accident report. So some of you may remember that that's the old George, this guy. I was on a Christmas vacation with our son in Paris when I got word that the last then in 2018 really good FAA engineers that was keeping our project alive had a health problem and retired. And I was standing there in front of the mirror with the razor and I thought, you know, this is going to take forever. I want to be able to mark the time, and I quit shaving. And that's where I was on September 1st of last year. So I'm going to do this real quick. This guy right here, he's our son. He's probably the world's most expensive facial plastic surgeon, San Francisco. We went out there to visit him on September 1st for the Labor Day weekend. And while we were driving from the airport, he was riding, somebody else was driving, and he got to look at his phone. He says, "Father, I just saw a thing flash on the internet that you got that STC for all the airplanes and all the engines." I said, "Yeah, we finally got it." Okay. So he hosted a dinner party for us that night in his apartment on the 51st floor of the Millennium Tower on Mission Street. And we discussed the success of G100UL. And then before dessert that night, he said, "We're going to interrupt and we're going to have a little ceremony." And he got a chair like one of these chairs, put it in front of a full-length mirror, had me sit down. He went to the bathroom, draped a towel over me, and then the world's most expensive facial plastic surgeon converted himself into the world's most expensive barber. Remember? Boy, I like this a lot better. He was going to take it all off, but when he got it down to this point, he said, "Yeah, I like that, let's leave it." So that's why we leave it up. So, look, there's been a bunch of really good people that have moved this project forward. Almost everybody that's anybody of significance inside the FAA has had their hand in this project at one time or another in the last 13 years. I'm going to go real quick through this because we got a bunch of other stuff to cover. But I want to mention Tony Broderick, Fran Favera at the engine propeller director. Tony's the former deputy administrator. He was retired, but he stepped in and got the project from being dumped in 2009 and 10. Fran Favera did a special good job. He retired in December of 2010. The project got passed around the then Air One, Mr. Renda Baker, God bless her soul, at the corner office at 800 Independence Avenue. She had to directly intervene from the highest level of certification twice to keep the project alive. The engineers that finally caught the project in Wichita, or strike, the engineer that had it, unfortunately the guy that got sick and had to retire, was Kevin Brain. He was spectacular. The good Mark Baker that you see sitting here at the little air show at Tarkio, Missouri, he asked for a briefing on July, I think, the 10th or something. July 7th. In Tarkio, I briefed him. I told him the project was stalled. And so then a week later, I got a call from the new Air One that took over after Dorinda, a guy named Earl Lawrence. And I think this is a direct quote. "George, I talked to Mark. This project's taken 5 years too long. I have reassigned everyone working on your project, and I have reassigned the project to a new team based in Wichita." Thank you, Mark Baker. Thank you, AOPA. Sometimes those guys, that organization, get complaints because they seem like they're too political and a lot of those other stuff, but I'm promising you they do good work and they understand the merits of this stuff. Some other people, the new Wichita team took off in 2020, the goal of getting it done. And they were headed by Kevin Marks there, project manager. Kevin's the guy that teaches detonation testing to the FAA Academy. Okay? It's not like he didn't know what the hell he was doing. Okay? Jeff Janis, assistant manager, superb, both of them superb engineers. Paul Wynn, the manager, he's now going to be the director of the newly reorganized Central Region for the FAA. They're reorganizing it in 3 regions, East, Central, and West, as of the week after Easter. And so then we made more progress in the next 12 months after it got reassigned to Wichita than we'd made in the previous 6 years or so. But unfortunately, after the initial STCs here at Oshkosh in the summer of 21, the project got sabotaged again in the fall of 21. And fortunately, we got a new Air One, a lady named Liu. She's a former very good engineer out of the Los Angeles FAA office, went to the transport director. She ended up in the corner office, head of all certification in Washington. And she took a hard look at the project and personally went out to the Wichita certification office and personally spent over 2 days going through the certification file herself. And went back to Washington. And I don't know this for a fact, but I don't think it's a coincidence that we got the STCs on September 1st as opposed to September 2nd or August 31st. I think she laid the law down and said, look, I've looked at this. I want this done by the 1st of September. So we had a whole team of 4 senior FAA people, including some of the Eagle people, come to Ada and spend all day Wednesday, all day Thursday, and all day Friday in Ada going through the cert file. And we were there answering all their questions. They did a deep dive review. And 3 weeks later, 2.5 weeks later, the STCs got issued. Then there's this little guy whose picture is over here, the Honorable Jim Inhofe. I think at least 4 different critical times during the course of this project, Jim intervened directly with the FAA or with Congress to keep this project alive. At one time, Congress tried to pass a bill banning STC fuels because it was being organized by some malicious actors both in and out of the industry. So with those credits and all of that behind us, at this point, over 500 aircraft have already purchased the STC from our website. You can go log on, it takes about 6-7 minutes. It automatically looks up the database and finds give it your end number, and it finds all the details. You do that, and in a few days, you'll start getting placards in the mail with flight manual supplement. You've already done that, correct? Did it work out okay for you?
It did. Yeah.
How was the process?
Easy.
Easy. All right, thank you. It's good feedback. So here's a sample of one of the possible placards. They're not all on the airplane, but this is one of the possible placards. Here's a selection of placards that are designed to fit around the different fuel filler ports on the aircraft. If you don't have those there and you land someplace that's got G100UL, the FBO might decline to fill up your airplane because they won't have any assurance that you've actually got the STC. So the placards are important. I'm going to pass this around. It's just a little formal sheet, and it's all basically the same stuff, except in this case you've got a clear one. If you've got a white wing, you can put a clear one like this on, and then this little placard in the center goes on the engine. And you can stick this on with high temp RTV at a convenient location. So that's what's involved. Pass it around at your leisure. That's what it looks like on the wing of a Cirrus. That's the fuel filler port on our Cirrus. It's had this fuel in and out of that filler point. You may have heard about some of the horror stories in the old PAFI program where I think one of the fuel candidate fuels, the Shell candidate fuel at Embry-Riddle, they spilled a little of it on the wing of one of the Cessnas down there. Before they could get a red rag to wipe it up, it stripped all the paint off the top of the wing. Give me a break, Shell Oil Company. For God's sakes, didn't you know that before you spent $3 or $4 million of the taxpayers' money testing your fuel? So we've monitored a lot of the online message boards. I'm going to try and pick up and answer a bunch of those questions today, and then I'll take questions from everybody else. Questions and misconceptions. A significant number of questions boil down to the following. Has there been any independent testing of G100UL Avgas by any of the OEMs? So you should all have one of these. If you don't, let us know. I'm going to talk about the data there a little bit. And I've got some extras here when you leave. If you want to take 1 or 2 to give away to other pilots and whatnot, we'll let you do that. So the answer is yes. And we're going to spend some time on this slide. Keep in mind, folks, This is not GAMI's data. This is not George Brawley and Tim Rails data. This is Cirrus aircraft data. Cirrus has done a whole bunch of independent testing for the PAFI program on all the different PAFI fuels at different times. And they asked us to send them some fuel. We sent them some conforming fuel in November. Because of the tax appreciation thing, they got hung up all through November and December because they delivered more airplanes in the month of December than they'd ever delivered in any one month in the history of the company. And so it was an all hands up. But in January, they got back and they got started testing. Terry Lesage, who's their chief test pilot, personally did the testing. I've known Terry since 2006. Superb flight test engineer. He's personally made the first flight in virtually every single make and model Cirrus that's been developed. He did it without any help from us of any kind other than shipping fuel. They wrote their own test plans. And then they went out and flew the airplane with one fuel in the right tank, the other fuel in the left tank. They even went to this exorbitant, extreme, unnecessary measure. They put a surge tank in the back of the airplane so that when they switched tanks, they could redirect the mongrel mixed fuel that was in the fuel lines to the surge tank for 5 minutes to make sure that there was no commingling of the fuels. Totally unnecessary, but they did it anyway. I mean, it's that level of detail. But what's really important about, or not the thing, but one of the really important aspects of this graph is that the horsepower numbers that you see there, unlike the horsepower numbers that we all deal with, they're not derived from looking at the book and saying, well, it had this much manifold pressure, the temperature was this, the RPM was this, la-di-da-di-da. Now he put a torque hub, he took the prop off, put a torque hub on the crankshaft, bolted the prop back up to it. He could directly measure torque and RPM with that instrument. And if you know those two things, you know horsepower. So this is a plot of brake horsepower and fuel flow. They've got the plane up to 16,000 feet. Turbocharger was kicking, even though it was a cold day in January. It had the temperature up to 62 F. And this is a cruise manifold pressure for that airplane. And then they had the engine running Gobby Rich over here. And they started leading the engine out on the 100 low lead, which is the blue trace, 100 low lead. And then they had to, they went and switched tanks, and they did exactly the same 10 minutes later. Same airplane, same altitude with the red trace. And all that, if you're taking off and climbing, this is where you do the takeoff and the climb, and they're all exactly the same. But if there's any measurable difference there, it's well within the error band of the instrumentation. But then things start to get interesting, because as they start to get back to peak, notice that peak fuel flow for the 100 low lead was here at about 20.8 gallons per hour for the blue line. And when they repeated the test on the G100UL, the peak TIT was at 20.1 gallons per hour. In engineering terms of combustion engineering, what's the significance of peak EGT or peak TIT? It marks the stoichiometric perfect ratio of fuel and air. When all the oxygen that's available consumes all the hydrocarbon BTUs that are available. That's what defines, and the fact that we've got an EGT, that peak EGT corresponds to that in laboratory tests. It corresponds to that stoichiometric point. In engineering terms, it's called an equivalent ratio of 1.0. We're not going to go there. So as they started getting from a rich mixture towards, and the Cirrus mandates in cruise that those airplanes be operated over here. Otherwise, they can't keep them cool. So this is the standard operating area in cruise for that Cirrus SR22T with a Continental TSL 550K. That engine in other iterations of the 350 horsepower engine, and the Cirrus iteration on a standard day, it's about 315 horsepower, but on a cold day, it gets up to 340, 350. At full power, which is where it was when they did this. They did this at full power at 35 or 36 inches. They did it at 30.5, they did it at 20.25, And I just picked this one because that would have been a high power cruise, for example. So now we're going to talk about the left-hand side of this curve, or this pair of curves. Notice the two curves start to diverge over here. As a matter of fact, down here at what would be about I don't know, 60 or 80 Lena peak, the 100UL at that precise fuel flow was running 236 horsepower, and the G100UL was running 246. 10 horsepower apart. Anybody got an explanation for that?
Fuel density for the
Pardon?
energy density of the fuel.
Give that man an applause round. Because nobody else in or out of Eagle has ever been able to identify and answer that question correctly. Yeah.
Really?
Really? So when you go to the pump to buy gasoline for your airplane engine, or even your car, what are you really trying to buy?
Energy.
You're trying to buy BTUs per gallon. BTU, energy per gallon. Okay? Now, if you've got a lean mixture, by definition, there's more oxygen molecules available than can be consumed by the fuel, by all the available energy content. That's the definition of a lean mixture. So there's plenty of oxygen over here to burn all the available energy. Because the G100 has more energy per gallon, and the scale is in gallons, it produces more horsepower. It's one of these laws of physics things. Now, that 4% difference, if you take this and you pull the fuel back until the horsepower is the same, the range of the airplane goes up 4% at the same airspeed. Or at the same fuel flow, it goes however much faster it's going to go on 4% more horsepower. Now, if you look at the laboratory spec sheets that come from the laboratory that analyzes the fuel, they've got a number in there that's megajoules per kilogram. You do the unit analysis and convert it to BTUs per gallon, and guess what the numbers have consistently been for the last 13 years? Somewhere between 3.5 and 4.1%. This flight test data just confirmed the laboratory test data on the energy content of the fuel. It's almost an elegant experiment, or experimental ratification of the laboratory test data. The comment by Terry Lesage, and I intended to excerpt it, put it up here word for word, but he said essentially the pilot could not distinguish between the two fuels other than the fact that at the same fuel,
Yes, there's a chair in the corner also.
that the engine ran slightly cooler and that they were able to lean the engine to lower fuel flows before combustion instability set in than what they could do with 100UL. Now, frankly, part of that is due to the fact it had more energy content. The other part of it is the combustion characteristics are a little more favorable for lean mixtures with this fuel. So takeaways: horsepower measured by calibrated torque hub, not GAMES data, independent OEM validation of GAMES data and the FAA certification. The fuel was completely transparent to the pilot, except he's going to get to enjoy 4% more range, 3.5% more range. Any questions about this data? Tim?
Kudos to Embry-Riddle for their independent testing.
Yes, also, Embry-Riddle flew nearly 200 flight hours doing on-aircraft engine durability testing coupled with functionality and reliability testing. The FAA exhibited some extreme good judgment in arranging this flight test to get the best of all possible worlds. So here's what we got out of the Embry-Riddle testing. We had to do a standard FAA durability test like you do on a new engine, except this is not really a new engine project. It's sort of something similar. So we were going to do that on Embry-Riddle's testing because I wanted somebody independent of us to do it. Because I'm tired of hearing all the being and moaning about nobody knows anything about what GAME's doing or nobody's verified it or didn't want any part of that. Well, they agreed to do it, put it on test stand. They were going to use a high compression Lycoming engine to do it with. Well, I was talking with the good engineer, Kevin Brain, who had the project. He was based out of Atlanta. And we were talking about how to do this. And I said, you know, Kevin, the FAA on other fuel projects has allowed the durability test, instead of being done on test stand, to be done on an airplane. He said, yeah. I said, well, why don't we think about doing that in this case? He said, you know, that's a really good idea because we'll get a bunch of functionality and reliability testing on the airplane and the whole system. He said, let me think about that. He said, yeah, let's do that. I said, well, Kevin, I said, there's one other thing. Everybody's going to gritch and moan that it works fine if you put it in a brand new engine. But what if I've got 1,000 hours on the engine and you put this fuel in there and it gets rid of all the lead deposits? Are they going to plug something up or cause a problem? I said, we need to answer that question at the same time. I said, why don't we, instead of taking a new engine, I said, we'll run the risk because it's a risk. Let's take a high time engine and do it. He said, well, I like that idea. He said, let me think about it. Next day he called me up and said, George, he said, I really like that idea, but he said, we got to be able to measure the parts because we got to be able to measure the wear rates on the parts. And we batted it back for. I said, tell you what, let's take off 2 of the cylinders. Leave the 1,400 hour cylinders on the engine. Go inside, measure up the crankshaft, put new bearings in that are measured and micrometered, measure all the parts on the 2 new cylinders, put them back on, and then go fly the test, and we'll have the best of both worlds. He said, I like that idea. He said, let me run a pest management. He called back the next day and said, let's do it that way. And that's what we did. So we got all this stuff all done in one test. If Paffy had been doing that test, it would take them 2 years, and they'd have used 5 different airplanes, and they wouldn't have had the same data.
$10 million.
Yeah, and $10 million that you paid for. So, you know, and we didn't write the test report. We didn't do the engine teardown. That was all done by Emory Riddle, their engineers, with the FAA guy from Atlanta standing there looking over their shoulder. So there's been an enormous amount of independent validation for this field that almost nobody acknowledges or is aware of. Anybody any questions about this graph? Yes, sir?
Yeah, this is a single flight test, right? So how many of these did you guys do?
Did we do?
Did you get similar results?
Oh, I want to show you something here in a second. We did a whole bunch of the same thing back in September of 2012, only we did it in hot weather instead of cold weather. That included flights to 25,000 feet, engine shutdowns, throttle slams, climb cooling, comparison back-to-back on 2 back-to-back flights with conformed fuel, with the fuel conformed to the high end of the vapor pressure range for hot day testing. You know, the vapor pressure spec is like 7.1 PSI, runs from 5.8 to 7.1, and we had the fuel at about 7.05 or something on both of it. Tim?
Material compatibility testing by both Cirrus and Emory Riddle.
Yeah, and so the FAA designed the material compatibility testing that we ended up doing. They were the one that came up with the proposed method for that. I had a different method. They had frankly, what turned out to be a much better idea on how to do that. But in addition, we did that on rubber bladders and all that standard stuff, but I got to thinking about it and I thought, well, you know, there's one airplane out there that's got OEM airplane that's got fiberglass fuel tanks, and that's Cirrus. So I contacted Pat Waddick of Cirrus, explained the problem to him, and God bless him. He said, send us some fuel and we'll repeat at our expense, using our engineers and our test plans, the same tests that we did on 100 low lead for compatibility with the Cirrus epoxy composite fuel tanks. And they did, wrote the reports, submitted them to the FAA with their DER signatures, and it was fully accepted. About that time, they changed their wing construction to include the carbon fiber components. They called us up and said, we want to redo the test. They did the whole test sequence again a second time with the different materials that were in their latest version of the wing structure. So it's been an enormous amount of that kind of testing. Any other questions about this guy before I move on? So everybody should have copies of this. Now, somebody said, you know, what kind of testing do you have? So this is the spring of 2010. Alan Clapmeyer called me up one day and said, I want to come to Ada and fly this fuel I've heard about. So he comes to Ada, he gets in our Cirrus, and we go up, we got up to whatever what altitude that was, 7,000 feet or something. And he was in the left seat, I was in the right seat. And he got the airplane, he had this test plan in his mind before he came, never shared it with me. Gets the airplane going along in cruise, and it's running 100 low lead on one tank, and the other tank's got G100UL in it. And he sits there and he watches it, and he documents it, and he documents it, and he documents it, and it's running, 70 degrees lean peak or something. And so it ends up at 164 point something indicated, and at 18.9 gallons an hour. We get through doing all that with the airplane stable for 5 or 10 minutes, and he takes the switches of fuel and sets it up again so it's running at exactly 18.9 gallons an hour, back to back. He sits there and watches it. He looks over at me and said, "George, something's wrong." I said, what do you mean?" He said, "We're going faster." I said, "Yeah." He said, "How can that be?" I said, "Because you got more BTUs per gallon." I said, "If you'll lean the mixture from about 18.9 down to about 18.3 and let it sit for 5 minutes, you'll end up at the same airspeed, because the energy content on every combustion stroke will be the same." So that's what he did. 164.5, 5-10 minutes later, same altitude, same everything. The science works, folks. We did essentially the same tests that Cirrus did 2 months ago, only we did it in the spring of 2010. There's all the data. One fuel's 100 low lead, the other G100. Well, the one that takes more fuel flow to go the same speed is the 100 low lead. The one that takes less fuel flow to go the same speed is the G100UL. Hard data. And the ratio of those two fuel flows, or the inverse of the ratio of those two fuel flows, comes out to, in this case, about 3.5%. So, Cirrus data, Duluth, GAMI data with Cirrus founder Alan Klappmeyer at Ada, same results, 13 years apart. So another question we got is, when's GAMI G100UL going to be at my airport? Boy, how many thousand times have I heard that question? So this gets to be a chicken and egg question. There's got to be demand before the existing distributors in the Avgas world are going to take fuel and move it to target airports. But there's not going to be any demand until there's fuel. And then how much is it going to cost? Because everybody's aware that it's likely going to cost more than 100 low lead. So we still get this question. So the answer is, basically, as soon as the supplier of 100 low lead to your airport FBO agrees to pay for it, load it on a rail car in Houston and take it to California. It'll get to California. We've made arrangements for it to be produced by a qualified producer in large volumes, 500,000 gallons up to 3 or 4 million gallons. Initial batch probably be more than 500,000 gallons. They're doing all the vetting and all the facilities and running some preliminary test runs right now. But they're highly motivated and enthusiastic. One of the principals in the company is a general aviation pilot. And he's got everybody in the company motivated. So is there a deployment plan? Yeah. Basically, look, California's crying. I got a phone call 3 months ago from some guy I didn't know in the California Department of Transportation. And it's about 2 o'clock in the afternoon my time. He starts saying, "Mr. Brawley, we don't know each other." But he said, "I'm with Caltrans." He said, "Can you tell me what your plans are to get this fuel at every single airport in California by December 31st of 2023, this year?" I said, "Really?" I said, "Well, we can talk about that, but I got a question." I said, "That's the 3rd time today somebody's called me up and asked me that question." I said, "I got an email this morning from the FAA that said it came from Washington headquarters, and we basically asking me the same question." I said, "What the heck is going on?" He kind of chuckled. He said, "Well, George, my boss at Caltrans got a phone call day before yesterday," wait for it, from Gavin Newsom, wanting to know when this fuel was going to be at every airport in California by the end of 2023. So he said he probably made a phone call to the Honorable Mayor Pete, who then called the acting administrator, who then called Lirio Liu, And she sent an email to Wichita, and Wichita called me up and asked me the same question, and somebody else in the FAA has already asked it to me again. So, yeah, that's the logical place to start. So here is one way to do this. It's not the only way, but we do have an appropriate, well-qualified, highly qualified, because big company, they already make aviation gasoline. They used to make 100 low lead, they now make mostly jet fuel. But they have the facilities, the expertise to do this. In our working and dealing with them, they're technically adept. They already have supply chain online that they already buy all of the components for this fuel, except for the one that comes from Germany. And he went through the thing, built me a spreadsheet on the cost basis for building the fuel. He said, look, he said, I can get everything I need here in our tanks and start building fuel in 2 weeks. But he said, this octane enhancer from Germany, how long is it going to take to get that to me? Well, I've got about a year's worth of it in storage in Houston. Yeah, those good German folks, they didn't want anything to do with supply chain hassles. They started putting in ISO containers a year and a half ago and shipping it to Houston as soon as the first STCs got approved. You know, God bless everybody that's tried to help. And conversely, different words to describe those that have tried to stop the project. So there's traditionally right now, there's 4 major distributors of Avgas, Avfuel, World Fuel, Titan, Epic. We've been in contact with all of those. Special kudos go to Avfuel and its president, because they started in working with us about 6 years ago in earnest, trying to help on this project. They put some money where their mouth is and helped us along when we needed some money to get over the finish line. They've helped us do ramp blending of fuel to send fuel to Cirrus by putting tanks on the ramp. They've really gone above and beyond. But at any event, we're going to have fuel produced. It will be available free on board railroad cars. Will probably be 20, 25 railroad cars of fuel made and available. And presumably these folks will take it in rail cars and take it to California. Initially, there's going to be 3 target airports, one at Bakersfield, one at Meadows Field. And there's a special reason for that I'll discuss with you. And then one at Watsonville, California, and then the obvious one is Reed Hillview. Now, I bet I get 3 phone calls a week from different airports in California wanting fuel. And basically, you know, how do we get in line? And I said, basically, I'm making notes, and to the extent that the logistics make it convenient to do this, we're going to try and get fuel to you in the order in which you stood up and raised your hand. Logistics may defeat that goal, but that's at least a significant priority for us. These 3 green dots that are in here, there's 2 of them up here and 1 up here at Meadowsfield and Bakersfield. They would be the initial point at which the fuel would be on sale. And then these other red dots that you see right there would be likely additional targets. So the fuel goes by rail car to California. It gets transloaded into transport trucks, gets put into tanks, and then the various airport refuelers move the airplane or move the fuel to the airplane wings if they don't put it in a central to refuel from an island. Keep in mind, a lot of people worry about, well, I don't like the idea that GAMI's going to have a monopoly on this thing. Okay, that's a reasonable concern. But our commitment has been that any qualified producer blender, this is one of them, can get a license from G100UL US, which is kind of our licensing entity, and from GAMI. GAMI occupies a very unique spot. We are what is called a production approval holder with the FAA. And this little company has the intellectual property, patent license stuff. And so they'll issue the license to producer, and GAMI will issue an authority from GAMI as the FAA's designated production approval holder, authorizing them to make the fuel. Without this authorization from the blue box, if they made a tank load of fuel and sold it in commerce, it would be a SUP. Anybody know what a SUP is? A suspected unapproved part. It's illegal to do that. You can go to jail for doing that. If you start selling aviation products and you don't have the proper authority to manufacture that product, that's an illegal part, and you can go to jail for that. So this is critical. And so our commitment to the industry, to each one of you and the industry, is that any qualified producer blender, this guy will be allowed to produce this fuel on the same cost and licensing basis as any other blender. That creates competition. We hope to go forward with that model. I don't see any reason why we can't, and certainly I don't see any reason why we shouldn't. Any questions about this chart?
Question, you said there were tankers, how many gallons are in each?
In a rail car or a truck? Rail car can hold like 28, but they're also weight limited, so probably 27,000 gallons of this fuel. Tank truck like that, 8,000 gallons.
Again, 8,000 weight-wise with galley, you know?
Well, 8,000 gallons in a truck like this, 27,000 gallons in a rail car.
But it won't go over weight with 8,000.
I don't think so. It might be 7,800, but something in that neighborhood. Any other questions?
The weight per gallon is 100 low lead?
Is 100 low lead?
Heavier fuel.
Our fuel's heavier. So that's a very good, interesting question, because if we go back to this chart, when Cirrus did some of the calculations based on brake-specific fuel consumption, which is not the right parameter to judge this, because that's based on pounds of fuel, but that pounds of fuel assumes a stated energy quantity per pound, which is variable all over the place with fuel chemistry. A lot of people use 5.875 pounds per gallon for Avgas. We round it off to 6 because it's easier to calculate. However, this is important to be aware of. I have seen a conforming batch of 100 low lead sold in commerce by one of the major producers that did not weigh 5.875. It weighed about 5.65. I have seen another batch of conforming 100 low lead from a producer that weighed 6.1 pounds per gallon. I have seen reports in the ASTM literature of conforming 100 low lead that weighed 6.3 pounds per gallon. So it's a fiction that it all weighs 6 pounds per gallon. It doesn't. And it's not controlled. There's no limit, no boundary condition set on that. So we all just round it off to 6 and declare that's good enough. Any other questions about this?
Wait, you said that yours is a little heavier, what is yours per gallon?
Okay, ours per gallon ranges from 6.15 to about 6.33 typically. Again, the energy content per gallon will always exceed 100 low lead by 3 to 4%. Any other questions about this graph?
So the increased weight is equivalent to the increased power, so it's the same power per pound.
Yeah, well, no, it's more, that is. There's actually less BTUs per pound, but more BTUs per gallon.
Okay.
It's within that error band when you start running the arithmetic. Real world example, you got an airplane that's got 100 gallon, 50 gallons in the left tank, 50 gallons in the right tank. You fill it up with this fuel, it's going to be 30, 35 pounds heavier than it would if you filled it up with 100 low lead. But the range of the airplane will be 4% greater. So if you took out 4% of the fuel, then it's going to weigh exactly the same as 100 low lead. So the range payload trade-off flexibility for the pilot actually goes up. We're talking stuff down in the weeds, folks. Let's not get wrapped around the axle. But if you want to get wrapped around the axle, let's at least do it clockwise instead of counterclockwise. Any other questions about this deployment plan?
So what's happening with
You know, you've done a fantastic job of getting to where you are today. It's amazing that you've been successful, in all honesty. But government's still playing their game up there with you know, so what's really gonna happen?
Well,
Or is this system gonna outrun it and then finally dies?
I suggest you read this article. It's the best concise description of the status of the fuels in the government that there is.
So you agree with that?
Yes. Everything that he said in there is technically accurate and substantively accurate, without exception. He did enjoy a bit of author's license at the end because he suggested that the Eagle Project should change its name. Create a new acronym called KIWI. Flightless bird, with a new acronym for Keep Industry Waiting Indefinitely. But no, what his description is of the Eagle candidate Phillips Field, and I've got some more slides. Let me go on to that before I'll do it. All right, so here's another option. This, for instance, this FBO that's got like 13 FBOs in California. They have expressed an interest in acquiring fuel and getting it to each one of their FBOs, and actually communicated with us a few days ago and said, we want to be the first FBOs in California to have your fuel. But it's not like there's unwilling people at the airports. And after we get California done, we're going to expand to the rest of the country. So everybody wants to know, how the heck much is this stuff going to hurt my pocketbook? So the question that came off the internet was, where are we now in 2023? I want to show you some comparison data. I pulled this off the internet last night. This is Meadows Field at Bakersfield, and one FBO 749, one 745, one 798 for Avgas. Folks, I'm going to tell you, this is just about $2.90 higher than what would be paid for this fuel in Houston. $2.90 difference. Do you think somebody can transport fuel from Houston to California and put it in the tank of your airplane for a delta of $2.90? They ought to be able to do that. And remember, we've got a built-in 4% bonus. So 4% times $7 is another 28 cents. So the discussion that we had before, what are you really buying? And you're really buying the BTUs per gallon. And so you're getting that bonus as you go along. Now, there are certain candidate fuels, one of which is described here, that uses ETBE as 40% of the fuel. And that fuel, because it has ETBE, has a deficit per gallon of about 5 to 8% in energy content. So between that fuel and G100UL, it's 9 to 11%. So if you're paying $7 a gallon for both fuels, you're getting 70 cents less value if you buy the fuel that's got the ETB in terms of the range of the airplane.
Hey, I had a question, you pulled up the Bakersfield Meadow. I just happen to have a lake house about 15 miles south of there. And I was just, and again, I fly out of Lakeland Airport, which is more in the LA area. And everybody that gets cheap fuel goes to the Santa Paula. I just pulled up right now what Santa Paula is at 5:30 today.
Oh, hell, yes. I mean, you go
Big
across,
difference. I mean, Meadows is a big commercial airport.
you go across town in Bakersfield, the other airport, it's about $5.40.
Okay, there you
Okay? No, there's no
go.
question.
I just, yeah, because you're comparing to get it there. And one last question while I have you. When is it going to hit Bakersfield Meadows? Is there a timeline just on that one?
Right now, we can get the fuel produced, I think sometime before the end of June. And as long as there's people that are willing to transport the fuel, buy the fuel, if the distributor's willing to buy it, move it to California, and it'll get there as fast as a rail car can get there. You know, at this point, the fuel by June should be produced, conformed, and it qualifies as being commercially available. And it's just a question of the distribution chain, what it does for it. Yes, sir.
Do FBOs have annual contracts to buy 100 low lead?
I don't have a clue, but I suppose they do, but it may be 100 low lead, but that brings up another whole subject. Folks, 2014, there was a lawsuit in California. Most of the FBOs were sued by the California Environmental Health Group. It started out being a lawsuit about warning signs for lead on the gates and the fences at the FBOs. But the way the final consent decree was signed a year later, there's a clause in that contract that says if a lower lead fuel, I'm paraphrasing, it says if a lower lead fuel, lower lead than 100 low lead, that is a high octane fuel is commercially available, that you have to stop selling 100 low lead. And I can't imagine if this fuel becomes commercially available that lawyer, that California Environmental Health Group is not going to be standing in front of a California judge asking for an injunction or writ of mandamus within a matter of days or weeks. So somebody asked about comparing the power pulses. I'm going to be this is real wonky engineering stuff. These are typical power pulses on our test stand for all 6 cylinders. If you do a statistical analysis of all of these running on G100, and you do the same thing on 100 low lead, you cannot tell the statistical difference. Every one of them varies from one combustion event to the next. But if you throw all that data in a big database and do a big expensive data analysis, statistically the combustion events are exactly have the same pressure profile, crank angle relationship. Well, why is that important? Because it means there is no issue with respect to vibration in the crankshaft and the propeller. And the FAA analyzed it, they agreed with that data analysis, and they said you don't have to do propeller vibration testing because the forcing functions are the same, and Isaac Newton taught us that the resulting vibrations would be the same. I think we learned that 400 years ago. More question? Purchase the STC, can't wait to get some of the tanks. What's the pot life of the fuel in a vented tank? And how long can it sit? Plain tank? We've had fuel sitting in barrels for 12 years that periodically been opened. There was one barrel that was opened at Embry-Riddle, sat in one of their hangars in Florida for like 3 years. There were 4 barrels that sat on the ramp at Mobile, Alabama that Continental was going to use to test and never got around to it. We had them send them back. Those fuels are all fine. So I don't think this is going to be a problem. So where are we now with Paffy and Eagle? Last Tuesday, they did this presentation for everybody. And there's a little note down here that you can see, and it says the Phillips fuel and the Lyondell fuels, well, they were doing preliminary screening tests and they ran into some problems with deposits. And those fuels have now been functionally withdrawn pending reformulation by Phillips and Lyondell. Your taxpayer dollars at work. Can you imagine Phillips Petroleum, with all of their expertise in blending fuels, that proposes a candidate fuel that they should know from reading the literature a half an hour, it's got manganese in it, it's going to leave deposits that are unacceptable. So it's really not a little minor setback, it's really back to the beginning for both of those. This is just, you know, the mealy-mouthed words from the FAA were going to fine-tune the formulation for deposit control. That was their public, you know, PR spin on it. What about other fuels? So far as we know, all the candidate fuels, the Eagle fuel plus the Swift Yellow one, have one or more of the following features: organometallic compounds. In the case of Phillips and Lyondell, it's manganese. In the case of the Swift fuel, it's ferrocene, it's iron. There's got to be 500 SAE automotive articles on the use of each one of those additives, and they all basically say don't do it because it's going to foul the spark plugs and foul the combustion chamber. The ferrocene, in one test at 38 hours, it encoded the white ceramic around the core of the spark plug with little red specks of iron. And then when the spark plug fired, instead of jumping the gap to the ground electrode, it was jumping it to the ceramic and shorting the ground across the ceramic. 38 hours. This is the sort of thing that the MMT does to a spark plug. It's just, the ETB results in 5 to 8% lower energy, or BTUs in the tank. Really? Is that where we want to go? Any last minute questions? Because we're getting real close here. All right, you and then you.
I, and I suspect several others in this room, have experimental aircraft. We can't legally put an FCC on the aircraft. I emailed your company and they correctly agreed with that. I may still need a sticker, and I feel.
Let me stop you and answer your question. I
Okay.
know where this is going. So John Sisk is building an RV-8. He called me up 3-4 months ago and said, what do I do? I want to get your fuel approved on my airplane. John, we've known John for 15, 20 years. I said, sure, we can do that. I said, I will write you a letter of authorization. If I have to, tell your FAA guy, your FSDO guy, that I could get him a signed FAA DER that authorizes you to rely upon our approved data, and you can add our fuel to your operating limitations. He did that and got it done transparently. The next question that you didn't ask, but somebody else was going to, is what about the warbirds? Because they're not in the FAA's database either. 2 months ago, I got a hold of the Confederate Air Force and said, well, I want to pick an appropriate airplane and I want to do a field approval of that to Warbird. So we picked a P-40 Warhawk. And we ran the paperwork, worked it cooperatively and productively and timely with the FAA's flight standards people in Oklahoma City. We signed the DER approvals authorizing our data as approved data to support the modification of the operating limitations on the P-40 Warhawk and the associated engine. Now, why did I pick a P-40 Warhawk? Well, that particular P-40 Warhawk is flown by one particular pilot that's got very high visibility. His name is Sam Graves, the chairman of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee that controls the FAA's budget.
Smart.
I didn't get up out of stupid land yesterday for this. Other questions? You?
Read vapor pressure compared to
Identical,
910. Okay, so
exactly the same.
even with the increased aromatics.
We had the same read vapor pressure within 2 or 3 tenths of the PSI when we did the test 25,000 feet on a real 105-degree day with 110-degree fuel in the fuel tanks before we took off. And the G100UL did slightly better on the vapor lock issues than the 100 low that did. Okay. Yes, sir?
By chance, have you done any work on two-stroke engines with Dixon oil?
I've not done any work on that, and I got a serious question about a Rotax engine.
I'm thinking chainsaws.
There is no known engineering reason why it shouldn't do exactly the same on a two-stroke engine or on a Rotax. And I'm pretty sure that we can do the same for the Rotax-powered fleet as we did for the Warbirds. All right, 1 or 2 more, and then I'll be out of time.
Yesterday, Lycoming said that there was no true, of the 4 candidate fuels, there's no true drop-in replacement. What's your response to that?
You're going to have to define the phrase drop-in. Now, in this article, the author of this article said terminology. We watch this subject, all this confusion. So to put a stop to the misinformation, I propose the following definitions. A fleet-wide approval, an FAA regulatory approval that allows a new fuel formulation and chemistry to be used on every existing spark ignition piston engine and every associated airplane found anywhere in the FAA engine and airplane databases without modification of the engines or aircraft other than placards. Folks, that's where we're at. Then a quote, drop-in replacement for 100 low lead, he proposed a fuel with fleet-wide approval which can be substituted for 100 low lead and transparently intermixed with 100 low lead in the fuel tanks of the aircraft and in the storage tanks at the airports without any alteration to the aircraft engines or airframes. So that's where we are. We meet those definitions, okay? Now, I bet I've heard 15 different definitions of a drop-in fuel. And one of the reasons it took so long to get here is because they had the wrong definition of a drop-in for the first 25 years.
George, Craig Sinpack from Bakersfield and Tim. Maybe everybody wants to thank you for your persistence over the years. I do it up close and personal. I can't even tell you. It's been a tough road, and it's approaching the finish line. It's not getting any easier. It's like football as you get close to the goal line. But you know, a great job in the industry. You know, we just really have to thank you. It's been great. So that's greatly appreciated. It's been a wonderful team effort with Tim and some spectacularly good support staff, engineers, John Paul, Jim Nell, and a whole bunch of others at GAMI that has made this possible.
Thank you.